In the quiet hum of a Midwestern town where streetlights flickered on just after 5, and the air always carried the faint scent of cut grass or distant rain, most people didn't expect much to happen. Life moved at the pace of slow-pouring syrup, steady, predictable, and sweet in its own unassuming way. Friday nights meant football under the bleachers, popcorn bags crinkling in the stands, and the high school marching band playing the same 3 songs with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Nobody came for the music. They came for the game, the gossip, the feeling of belonging to something bigger than themselves. Even if that something was just a town of 8,000 people who all knew each other's grandparents. But behind a pale blue garage with peeling paint on the edge of Maple Street, something else was happening, something no one noticed, because it didn't announce itself with lights or crowds or social media posts. It was just a young woman alone, with a trumpet older than she was, practicing long after the last car had pulled out of the school parking lot. She wasn't trying to be seen. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just chasing a sound, the kind that lives in your chest before it ever reaches your ears. She'd found the trumpet in her grandfather's attic the summer she turned 12. It was tucked inside a worn leather case, brass tarnished green in spots, the mouthpiece slightly dented but still whole. He'd been a jazz lover in his youth, playing in smoky clubs along the river before life. Marriage, kids, a factory job pulled him away from the stage. He never talked about it much, but sometimes when he thought no one was listening, he'd hum old melodies while fixing the porch swing or watering his tomatoes. When she asked about the trumpet, he just smiled and said, "That old thing? Go ahead, see if it still sings." It did. Not right away. The first few weeks were all squeaks and frustration, lips swollen, fingers clumsy. But she kept at it. Every afternoon after homework, every weekend morning before chores, she'd sit on the garage steps or stand in front of the cracked mirror inside and play. Not scales, not drills, at least not only those. She played songs she heard on the radio, movie themes, hymns from Sunday service, even the ice cream truck jingle, just to see if she could make it sound like something deeper. And slowly, miraculously, the notes began to speak. Not just sound, speak. There was a warmth in her tone, a vulnerability that didn't try to shout over the world but instead invited you to lean in and listen. At school, she was easy to miss. She wore oversized hoodies even in spring, kept her hair tucked behind her ears, and never raised her hand unless called on. In band class, she sat in the back row, never asking for solos, never complaining when the director handed the spotlight to louder, flashier players. She didn't mind. She wasn't there for applause. She was there because the band room smelled like old wood and valve oil, and for an hour each day, she could disappear into the music without anyone expecting anything from her. But outside of school, something different happened. On Saturday mornings, she'd walk her bike down to the farmer's market set up in the town square. She didn't have a permit or a fancy setup, just a folding stool, her trumpet, and an open guitar case at her feet for tips. She'd play for an hour or two, mostly standards. Autumn Leaves, My Funny Valentine, sometimes a slow, bluesy take on Summertime. People would pause while picking out peaches or waiting for coffee, listen for a verse or two, drop $1 or $2 in the case and move on. She never made much, enough for a snack, maybe a new read, but that wasn't the point. The point was the connection. The way a tired mother would close her eyes and smile for the first time all week. The way an old man once stood still for 10 full minutes, tears in his eyes, before quietly placing a $5 bill in the case and walking away without a word. One Saturday, a teenager with a phone stopped to film her. He didn't ask. Just hit record from across the square, zoomed in on her hands, the glint of the bell catching the morning sun, the way her shoulders moved with the rhythm. He posted it that night with a simple caption, "Random girl at the market playing like she's got nothing to lose." It wasn't meant to go viral. It wasn't polished or dramatic. Just 30 seconds of raw, unfiltered music in the middle of ordinary life. But the internet has a way of finding truth, even when it's hiding in plain sight. The video got a few hundred views at first, mostly locals recognizing the square. A couple of comments like, "That's Lila from West High." Or, "She plays at the library sometimes too." Then a week later, someone shared it in a jazz forum. Then a music teacher reposted it with the note, "This is what real tone sounds like." No effects, no editing, just heart. Views climbed into the thousands. People started leaving longer comments. Who taught her? Why isn't she in a conservatory? This gave me chills, and then one evening, as she wiped down her trumpet after practice, Her phone buzzed with a notification that made her freeze. A verified account, the kind with a blue check and millions of followers, had quoted the video. The caption read, "Kids got chops. Tell her to meet me after the show Friday. We'll duel for fun. Winner buys pizza." Below it, thousands of replies exploded. Is he serious? She's just a kid. Bro, she's better than half your backup band. Don't do it. This is a trap. This is the coolest thing I've seen all year. She stared at the screen, heart hammering. She knew exactly who it was. Everyone knew him. A trumpet legend who'd risen in the late 80s, blending bebop with funk and soul in a way no one had done before. He'd played with icons, won Grammys, headlined festivals from New Orleans to Tokyo. He was known for his swagger, his lightning-fast runs, and his love of impromptu jam sessions, but also for his sharp tongue and his habit of calling out musicians he thought were playing it safe. She'd listened to his albums for years, studied his phrasing, tried and failed to mimic his breath control. To her, he wasn't just famous, he was a mountain, and now somehow he'd seen her. Not just seen her, challenged her. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down. She told no one that night. Not her mom, who was working the late shift at the hospital, not her best friend, who'd probably scream and start planning outfits. She just sat on the garage floor, trumpet in her lap, replaying the video in her head. Was it a joke? A publicity stunt? Or was it real? The concert was in a city 2 hours away. She didn't have a car, didn't have money for a ticket, let alone gas and food, but the thought wouldn't leave her. What if she went? What if she just showed up? Not to win, she knew she couldn't outplay him, but to stand in the same room, to hear him live, to say thank you for noticing her at all. All week she saved every dollar. She sold her old textbooks online, took extra shifts helping neighbors walk dogs and mow lawns. On Thursday night, she packed a small backpack, her trumpet, a spare mouthpiece, a granola bar, her student ID, and the only nice shirt she owned, a simple black one her grandmother had given her for graduation. Friday morning, she called her mom from the bus station. Going to the city for a college info session, she said, voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Her mom, tired but trusting, told her to be safe and call when she got back. The bus ride was long and bumpy. She watched cornfields blur into suburbs, then into downtown lights, her stomach twisted with every mile. She kept imagining him laughing when he saw her. "You're the garage kid?" he'd say, shaking his head. "Go home. This isn't a game." But another voice, quieter but stronger, whispered, "You belong there too." When the bus dropped her off near the arena, she walked the last few blocks, trumpet case bumping against her leg. The venue loomed ahead, all steel and glass, buzzing with fans and band tees and glitter. Security guards stood at every entrance. She didn't have a ticket. Didn't have a backstage pass. All she had was a tweet and a hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would remember it. She found the stage door around back, tucked between delivery trucks and coiled cables. A burly man in a headset stood guard, arms crossed. She approached slowly, hard in her throat. "Hi," she said, voice barely above a whisper. I was supposed to meet someone here." He frowned. "Name?" She hesitated. "I don't have an appointment, but..." He tweeted about a trumpet duel last week with me. The guard stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "Kid, we get 10 people a day saying the boss invited them." "Go home." She didn't move, just stood there gripping her case like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Then from inside a voice called out, deep, amused, unmistakable. "Who's causing a scene out there?" The door opened a crack, and there he was, sunglasses on, gold chain glinting, a half smile playing on his lips. He looked her up and down, taking in the hoodie, the scuffed sneakers, the nervous set of her shoulders. "You're the garage kid?" he asked. She nodded, unable to speak. He studied her for a beat longer. Then, to everyone's surprise, including his own, he stepped aside. "All right," he said, gesturing her in. "Let's hear what you've got." And just like that, the quiet girl from Maple Street stepped into a world she'd only ever dreamed of. Not as a fan, not as a student, but as someone who dared to answer a call, even when no one expected her to show up. But that moment, the duel, the silence, the shift in the air was still minutes away. For now, she was just standing in a dimly lit hallway, surrounded by strangers, her hands cold, her breath shallow, wondering if the sound she'd spent years chasing would finally be enough. And deep down, beneath the fear, something else stirred. Not confidence, not pride, but the quiet certainty that she'd come this far not to win, but to be true. To the music, to herself, to the old trumpet that had once belonged to a man who believed in second chances. Whatever happened next, she'd already changed. She just didn't know it yet. Backstage at the arena was nothing like she'd imagined. It wasn't glamorous or quiet. It was chaos wrapped in low lighting and the constant hum of electricity. Cables snaked across the floor like black vines. Roadies shouted over one another in shorthand only they understood. And the smell of coffee mixed with the sharp tang of sweat and brass polish. She stood just inside the door, frozen, clutching her case like it might vanish if she loosened her grip even a little. Her hoodie felt too thin now, too ordinary in a place where everyone seemed to move with purpose, dressed in black tees with tour logos or headsets dangling like badges of belonging. The musician, who still hadn't introduced himself, leaned against a rack of spare microphones, arms crossed, watching her with a look that wasn't quite skepticism, but something close to curiosity. He'd taken off his sunglasses, revealing tired eyes that had seen decades of stages, late nights, and countless musicians come and go. Most of them had swaggered in, eager to prove themselves. This one just looked like she was trying not to disappear. "You really came," he said, voice lower now, less performative. She nodded again, still unable to find words. Her throat felt tight like she'd swallowed cotton. He pushed off the rack and walked toward her slowly, boots clicking on the concrete. "You know I was joking, right? That tweet was just something to say. Didn't think anyone would actually show up," she swallowed. "I know," she managed. "But I had to." "Had to?" He raised an eyebrow. "Had to what? Lose in front of my whole crew?" "No," she said, and this time her voice came out clearer, firmer. "Had to hear you play live, had to—" "Thank you for seeing me." That stopped him. He blinked, as if the idea hadn't occurred to him, that someone might come not to compete but to connect. A stagehand walked by carrying a stand, gave her a quick once-over, and kept going. The sound check from the main stage rumbled through the walls, a bass line thumping like a heartbeat. She could feel it in her ribs. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, kid, I don't do duels. Not really. That was just talk. But since you're here..." He glanced around, then nodded toward a small side room marked warm-up. "We've got 20 minutes before I go on. You want to play something? Just for fun. No pizza bet, no crowd. Just you and me." Relief washed over her so fast it made her dizzy. She wasn't being tested. She wasn't on trial. It was just music. Inside the warm-up room it was quieter. Just a folding chair, a music stand, and a single lamp casting a warm pool of light. He set his own trumpet on the stand, a gleaming instrument with custom engraving along the bell. Hers looked humble beside it, scratched and worn but honest. "You go first," he said, leaning against the wall. "Play me something you love." She hesitated. Part of her wanted to pick something flashy, something that would prove she belonged. But the other part, the deeper part, knew that wasn't why she was here. So she opened her case, wiped the mouthpiece with the edge of her sleeve, and brought the trumpet to her lips. She didn't choose a jazz standard or a technical showpiece. Instead, she played a melody her grandfather used to hum while fixing things around the house. A simple, wordless tune that had no name, just feeling. It started soft, almost hesitant, like morning light creeping over hills. Then it grew, not louder, but fuller, richer, as if each note carried a memory. The smell of his workshop, the creak of the porch swing, the way he'd wink at her when no one else was looking. She closed her eyes. And for those few minutes, she wasn't backstage at an arena. She was back in the garage playing for no one but the walls and the wind. And that was enough. When she finished, the room was silent. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that comes after something true has been spoken. He didn't clap. Didn't say nice job. He just stared at her for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. "Where'd you learn to play like that?" "Nowhere special," she said, lowering the trumpet. "Just everywhere I could." He nodded slowly, like he understood more than she'd said. Then he picked up his own horn. "All right, I turn." What followed wasn't a performance. It was a storm. He launched into a piece she recognized from one of his early albums, a fast, intricate cascade of notes that twisted and turned like a river in flood. His fingers flew, his breath controlled and powerful, Every phrase layered with rhythm, surprise, and sheer joy. It was dazzling, intimidating, alive in a way recordings could never capture. But halfway through, something shifted. He slowed. Not because he'd made a mistake, no, it was deliberate. He began weaving in fragments of the melody she'd just played. Not copying it, but answering it, turning her quiet phrase into a call, his trumpet the response. It wasn't planned. It wasn't rehearsed. It just happened, like two strangers finding a language they didn't know they shared. When he finished, he lowered his horn and looked at her, not as a legend looking down, but as one musician to another. "You've got something," he said quietly. "Not just skill, voice. That's rare." She didn't know what to say. No one had ever called her playing a voice before. To most people, it was just noise, background sound, something to ignore. Before she could respond, a voice crackled over a nearby speaker. 5 minutes to stage. "Boss." He nodded, already slipping back into performer mode. But as he turned to leave, he paused. "You staying for the show?" She shook her head. "I don't have a ticket." He pulled out his phone, typed something fast, then handed a message to a passing assistant. "Get her a seat. Front row. And tell security she's with me." She opened her mouth to protest. She didn't want special treatment, but he held up a hand. "Consider it. Repayment for that melody. I haven't heard something that real in years." Then he was gone, swallowed by the hallway's energy, already shifting into the persona the crowd expected. She sat alone in the warm-up room for a few minutes, heart still racing. She hadn't won a duel. There hadn't even been one. But something had happened, something quiet and seismic. She'd been seen, not as a kid, not as a novelty, but as a musician. Later, seated in the front row, close enough to see the sweat on his brow, the way his fingers danced over the valves, she watched him command the stage like it was an extension of his body. The crowd roared after every solo. Lights flashed. Smoke curled from the floor. But during the third song, he paused, raised a hand for silence, and said into the mic, "Earlier today, I met someone who reminded me why we do this. Music isn't about fame. It's about feeling. So this next one's for the girl in the hoodie who showed up with nothing but a horn and heart." Then he played a slow, tender version of that unnamed melody, the one from her grandfather's porch. The audience didn't know its origin, but they felt it. You could see it in the way people leaned forward, how the chatter died down, how some closed their eyes like they were remembering something they'd almost forgotten. She sat there, tears welling but not falling, knowing this moment wasn't hers to keep, but it was hers to carry. After the show, she waited near the stage door again, not sure if he'd remember her, but he did. He came out wearing a leather jacket, no sunglasses now, looking tired but lighter somehow. "You heading back tonight?" he asked. She nodded. "Last bus leaves in an hour." He didn't offer money, didn't offer advice, just said, "Keep playing. And don't let anyone tell you your sound isn't enough." Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. "This is my old teacher. Lives upstate. Retired, but still takes students if they're serious. Tell him I sent you. And tell him you play like you've got ghosts in your bell." She took the card with trembling fingers. It was just a name, a phone number, a street address, but it felt like a key. On the bus ride home, the city lights fading behind her, she stared out the window. Her trumpet sat in her lap, cool and familiar. She thought about the melody, the way he'd echoed it on stage, the way strangers had listened like it mattered. Nothing in her life had changed on the surface. She still lived in the same house, still wore the same hoodies, still practiced in the same garage. But inside, something had shifted. She wasn't just playing for herself anymore. She was playing for the people who needed to hear it, even if they didn't know it yet. And somewhere, in a quiet attic or a bustling city or a farmer's market on a Saturday morning, another kid might be picking up an old instrument, wondering if their voice matters. Now, because of one impulsive tweet and one brave decision to show up, the answer was a little clearer. Yes, it does, but the story wasn't over. Not even close. Because when you give someone a chance, even by accident, you don't just change their life. You change your own. And the musician, for all his fame and fire, was about to learn that the greatest solos aren't the ones you play alone, but the ones you invite others to join. The card sat on her kitchen table for 3 days. Not because she didn't want to call, it was because she kept picking it up, staring at the name and number, then setting it back down like it might burn her fingers. It felt too big, too real. This wasn't just some random contact. This was a lifeline thrown from a world she'd only ever watched through a window, and part of her worried that if she reached for it, she'd find out the window was locked after all. Her mom noticed the card but didn't ask. She'd seen the change in her daughter since the night of the concert, the way she practiced with more focus, the quiet confidence in her posture, the way she hummed while doing dishes like she was working out a melody in her head. So when she finally saw her dialing the number 1 rainy afternoon, she just poured 2 mugs of tea and left one by the phone. The voice on the other end was older, gravelly but kind, with the slow cadence of someone who'd spent a lifetime listening more than speaking. He didn't sound surprised to hear from her. "Ah," he said after she stammered out her name and mentioned who'd sent her. "The garage player." He called ahead. "Said you've got ghosts in your bell." She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I don't know what that means." "Means you play like you've lived," he said simply, "even if you haven't seen much yet." They talked for nearly an hour, not about technique or theory, but about why she played. What music meant to her. He asked about her grandfather, about the farmer's market, about the silence between notes. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to prove anything. She just had to be honest. At the end of the call, he said, "There's a summer program I help run, small. No cameras, no auditions for the public. Just serious students who want to learn, not perform. You'd have to audition for me privately, though. Can you be here next Saturday?" She could. She would. Even if it meant taking 3 buses and walking 2 miles in the heat. The audition wasn't in a concert hall or a fancy studio. It was in his living room, a cozy space filled with books, sheet music stacked like bricks, and a piano that looked like it had survived a few wars. He sat in a worn armchair, hands folded, eyes sharp but gentle. "Play me something that scares you," he said. She thought for a moment. Then she chose a piece she'd always admired but never dared to attempt. A complex emotional solo from a 1960s jazz suite known for its emotional depth and technical demands. Halfway through, she flubbed a passage, her fingers fumbling under pressure. She stopped, cheeks burning. "It's okay," he said. "Start again. But this time, don't play it like you're trying to get it right. Play it like you're telling someone you love them." She took a breath, closed her eyes, and played it not perfectly, but truthfully. The notes bent, cracked in places, soared in others. It wasn't flawless, but it was alive. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he nodded. "You're in, just like that. No fanfare, no committee. Just one man hearing something in her that she hadn't even known was there." The summer program was held at a quiet college campus tucked in the hills, far from city noise. There were only 12 students, all older, most from music schools in New York or Chicago. At first she felt out of place, her clothes too plain, her background too ordinary. But the moment she played during the first ensemble session, the room changed. Not because she showed off, but because she listened. She didn't just play her part. She wove it into the others, leaving space, answering phrases, creating something bigger than any one person. The old teacher watched from the corner, sipping black coffee, rarely speaking, but every so often he'd give a small nod, just enough to let her know she was on the right path. Meanwhile, back home, the story of the Trumpet Duel had taken on a life of its own. The musician hadn't just mentioned her on stage that one night. He'd started talking about her in interviews. Not by name, never by name, but in ways that made people curious. "There's a kid out there," he'd say on a podcast, "who reminded me that music isn't about how fast you can play, but how deep you can feel." A local news station tracked her down, wanting to do a feature. She politely declined. She didn't want to be a story. She just wanted to get better, but the ripple was already spreading. At her high school, band enrollment jumped for the first time in a decade. The director, who'd once barely noticed her, now encouraged shy students to try solos. A music store in the next town started offering free beginner lessons for brass instruments, citing unexpected interest. And online, young players, especially girls, began posting videos of themselves practicing, often with captions like, "For the garage kid," or "Trying to find my voice." She didn't see most of it. She was too busy learning how to breathe properly, how to shape a phrase like a sentence, how to make silence as powerful as sound. But when she came home for a weekend, her little cousin, a quiet 10-year-old who'd never shown interest in music, was waiting with a plastic recorder and a determined look. "Can you teach me?" she'd asked. That night, sitting on the porch with the summer air thick with crickets, she realized something. The duel hadn't been about winning. It had been about opening a door, and now others were walking through it. The real turning point came near the end of the summer. The program culminated in a small invitation-only recital. Families, a few local musicians, no press. She was scheduled to play a solo piece she'd been working on for weeks, a composition that blended her grandfather's melody with elements she'd learned that summer. It was personal, raw, full of space and longing. The night of the recital, her hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from nerves about the audience, but from the weight of what this moment meant. This wasn't just a performance. It was a promise, to her grandfather, to the old teacher, to the musician who'd taken a chance, and to herself. She walked onto the small stage, trumpet in hand. The lights were soft. The room was still. She raised the horn to her lips and then froze. A familiar figure sat in the back row, arms crossed, leaning against the wall like he owned the shadows. The musician. He hadn't said he was coming. He hadn't posted about it. He was just there, watching quietly like a regular person. She took a breath and played. This time there were no mistakes. Not because she was perfect, but because she wasn't trying to be. She played like she was talking to someone she loved, like she was saying thank you, goodbye, and hello all at once. When she hit the final note, a long, sustained tone that hung in the air like a held breath, the room didn't applaud right away. They just sat with it, letting it settle into their bones. Then, slowly, the musician stood. Not to lead a standing ovation, but just to nod. A single, solemn nod that said more than any words could. Afterward, he found her outside, where she'd gone to catch her breath under the stars. "You've grown," he said. "I had help," she replied. He smiled. A real one, not the stage kind. "You had heart." The rest was just details. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the distant hum of the campus. Then he said, "I've got a show next month in Chicago. There's a guest spot in the second set, if you're ready." Her pulse jumped. "You mean on stage? With you?" "Yeah," he said. "Not as a gimmick. As a player." She didn't say yes right away. She thought about it, the lights, the crowd, the pressure. But then she thought about the garage, the farmer's market, the old teacher's living room. All those quiet spaces where music had lived before anyone noticed. "I'll do it," she said. He clapped her lightly on the shoulder. "Good, and don't wear a hoodie this time," she laughed. For the first time, it didn't feel like she was stepping into his world. It felt like they were building a new one, together. Back home, she told her mom. They didn't celebrate with fanfare, just a quiet dinner, extra cornbread, and a long hug. Her mom didn't say much, but her eyes said everything. "I always knew you could." In the weeks leading up to the Chicago show, she practiced harder than ever, not to impress, but to be worthy of the trust he'd placed in her. She worked with the old teacher over video calls, refined her phrasing, learned to project without losing tenderness. She even bought a new shirt, still simple but clean, black with no logos, something that said, "I belong here," without shouting it. The night of the show, she arrived early, this time with a backstage pass clipped to her belt. The crew recognized her now. They nodded as she walked by, some even saying hello. She warmed up in the same side room as before, but this time she wasn't alone. A few band members stopped by to listen, offering quiet words of encouragement. When it was time, she walked onto the stage, not from the wings, but from the audience, as part of the surprise. The lights were blinding at first. The crowd, 1,000 strong, was a sea of shadows and sound. Her heart pounded so hard she thought the mic would pick it up. But then she saw him, center stage, trumpet raised, giving her a look that said, "You've got this," and she did. She played her solo with clarity, warmth, and a quiet strength that filled the arena. Not because she was trying to outshine anyone, but because she finally understood. Music wasn't a competition. It was a conversation, and she had something to say. After the show, fans lingered, hoping for autographs. She signed a few programs, but mostly she just smiled and said thank you. One young girl, no older than 12, held out a beginner's trumpet and whispered, Will you show me how to start?" She knelt down, took the instrument gently, and showed her how to form her lips, how to breathe from the belly, how to make the first sound, not perfect, but present. As she walked back to the bus station later that night, trumpet case in hand, city lights reflecting in puddles from an earlier rain, she felt something settle inside her. She wasn't famous. She wasn't rich. But she was seen. And more importantly, she was hearing. Not just notes, but people. Their hopes, their silences, their unspoken songs, and that, she realized, was the real duel. Not against another player, but against doubt, against invisibility, against the idea that only certain people get to make music that matters. She'd won, not by beating anyone, but by showing up, again and again, with nothing but honesty and a horn that still carried her grandfather's echo. The world hadn't changed overnight. But somewhere, in a garage, a classroom, a market square, another quiet player was picking up their instrument thinking, maybe I can too. And that was enough. More than enough. Life didn't explode into fame overnight. There were no magazine covers, no viral interviews, no record deals handed over with flashing cameras. What happened instead was quieter, slower, but deeper, like roots spreading under soil, unseen but strong. After the Chicago show, things shifted in ways that didn't make headlines but changed everything for the people who mattered. She went back to school that fall, still wearing hoodies, still sitting in the back row of band class, but now, when the director called for volunteers to try a solo, a few students glanced her way, not with envy but with respect. And sometimes, when she stayed late to help tune instruments or show a freshman how to clean their valves, others started staying too, not because they had to, but because they wanted to be near that quiet confidence, that sense that music wasn't about being the loudest, but about being true. Her weekends at the farmer's market continued, though now a small crowd gathered when she played. Not huge, just a dozen people or so standing in a loose circle, listening like they were part of something sacred. She never changed what she played. Still the same old standards, still her grandfather's wordless tune, still the ice cream truck jingle turned tender. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. She just needed to show up. But the biggest change wasn't in her, it was in the musician. People who'd followed his career for decades noticed it first. His shows started feeling different. Less like performances, more like gatherings. He began opening sets with stories. About mentors, about mistakes, about the time a kid with a dented trumpet reminded him why he fell in love with music in the first place. He stopped calling out other players on social media. Instead, he'd share clips of young musicians he'd discovered, always with the same note. Listen past the notes. Hear the heart. He even canceled 2 festival appearances to host free workshops in underserved communities, places where music programs had been cut for years. He didn't bring a full band, just a trumpet, a folding chair, and a willingness to sit with kids who'd never held a real instrument before. Reporters asked why he'd changed. He'd just shrug and say, "Got reminded that legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you lift up." Meanwhile, the old teacher, the one with the gravelly voice and the living room full of sheet music, started getting calls. Not from prodigies or competition winners, but from parents whose kids had seen the garage player's story online and suddenly wanted to learn trumpet. "They don't care about solos," one mother told him. "They just say, 'I want to play like her.'" He'd laugh and say, "Then they've already started." He began accepting more students, even though his knees ached and his eyes tired easily. "If they're coming with honest ears," he'd say, "I'll teach with honest hands." Back in her town, the high school band director, who'd once handed solos only to the loudest, flashiest players, started doing something new. Every Friday, he'd ask a different student to choose a piece and lead warm-ups. Not the best player, just someone who loved the music. Attendance at rehearsals climbed. Kids who used to skip practice now showed up early, just to try out ideas. The band didn't win any state championships that year, but they played with more joy than anyone could remember. She watched it all unfold like a slow sunrise. No sudden burst, just light spreading, warming everything it touched. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope. No logo, just her name and address in neat handwriting. Inside was an acceptance letter, not just to a music school, but to a top conservatory on the East Coast, with a full scholarship covering tuition, housing, even a stipend for instrument maintenance. The letter mentioned her summer program, her distinctive voice, and a personal recommendation from both the old teacher and, surprisingly, the musician himself. She read it 3 times before showing her mom. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where the audition card had once trembled in her hands, and cried quietly into their coffee mugs. No grand speeches, just two people holding onto a dream that had once felt too big to name. She didn't tell many people at first. She didn't want it to feel like she was leaving them behind. But when she finally mentioned it to her bandmates, they threw a surprise send-off in the band room. Balloons tied to music stands, a cake shaped like a trumpet slightly lopsided, and a group performance of her grandfather's melody, played by every section, even the percussionists tapping out the rhythm on their chairs. "You'll come back, right?" one of the freshmen asked, eyes wide. She smiled. "Music doesn't live in one place. I'll be back every chance I get." And she meant it. Moving to the city was overwhelming at first. The noise, the pace, the sheer number of people who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. Her dorm room was smaller than her garage, and the practice rooms were always booked. But she found her rhythm. She joined a student ensemble that played everything from classical to experimental jazz. She stayed late after class to talk with professors who'd once seemed like distant legends. And on weekends, when she missed the smell of cut grass and the sound of crickets, she'd take the subway to a park and play for no one but the trees. But she never forgot where she came from. During winter break, she returned home not as a star but as herself, just with more stories and a slightly better mouthpiece. She visited the farmer's market, played for an hour, and stayed to help pack up stalls. She stopped by the high school and spent an afternoon with the band, not as a guest artist, but as a former student who remembered what it felt like to be invisible. And she visited the old teacher, who greeted her with a pot of strong tea and a new stack of sheet music. "Play me something you wrote," he said. She had. A short piece, just 2 minutes long, blending the rhythm of city subways with the quiet hum of her hometown nights. He listened without moving, eyes closed. When she finished, he said, "You're not just playing music anymore. You're making it breathe." That spring, the musician invited her to join him on a short tour, not as an opener, but as a featured collaborator. They played in theaters, community centers, even a library in a town smaller than hers. After each show, they stayed for Q&As, not about technique or gear, but about courage, doubt, and why music matters when the world feels broken. At one stop, a teenager asked, "How do you keep going when no one's listening?" She looked at the musician, then back at the kid. "You play anyway," she said, "because someone might be listening closer than you think." He nodded beside her like he was hearing it for the first time too. Back at school, she started something small. Every month, she'd organize an open session in a practice room. No auditions, no judgment. Just a space where anyone could come and play, even if they only knew 3 notes. At first, only a few showed up. But word spread. Soon, violinists sat next to sax players, pianists jammed with beatboxers, and a shy girl from the engineering department brought her grandfather's old cornet and played for the first time in public. No one filmed it. No one posted it. It just was. And that was the point. The conservatory offered her a chance to record a debut EP. She agreed, but only if she could produce it herself, in a simple studio with minimal editing. "I don't want it to sound perfect," she told the producer. "I want it to sound human." The result was a 6-track collection that critics called strikingly intimate and emotionally unguarded. It didn't top charts, but it found its people, the ones who needed to hear that it's okay to be tender, to be uncertain, to carry your history in your sound. One track, the final one, was just her and the trumpet, playing her grandfather's melody one last time, with a single piano note echoing in the background like a memory. Listeners wrote in saying it made them call their grandparents, made them dig out old instruments, made them cry in parking lots at 2 a.m. She never expected that. She'd just been saying thank you. By the time graduation neared, she had offers, management deals, recording contracts, invitations to join big-name ensembles. But she turned most of them down, not out of pride but clarity. She didn't want a career built on spectacle. She wanted one built on connection, so she made a plan. She'd tour, yes, but only in places that asked for her, not just paid the most. She'd record, but on her own terms, and every summer, she'd return to her hometown to teach free workshops for kids who couldn't afford lessons. She called it the Garage Sessions, and the first year 20 kids showed up. By the third, they had to rent the school gym. The musician came to the first one not to perform but to help set up chairs. He stayed in the back watching her guide a nervous 8-year-old through their first note. Afterward, he handed her a thermos of coffee and said, You're doing it better than I ever did." She shook her head. "You opened the door. And you walked through it like you owned the place," he said with a grin. "That's on you." They didn't talk about legacy much, but they didn't need to. It was in the way kids now brought their own trumpets to school, in the way band directors across the state started asking, "What's your story?" before "What's your range?" It was in the quiet hum of practice rooms late at night, in the shared nods between strangers who'd heard the same melody and felt less alone. She still played in garages, just bigger ones now, with better acoustics and more people listening. But the feeling was the same: music as a gift, not a weapon. As a bridge, not a ladder, and somewhere, in a town not so different from hers, another young person was picking up an old instrument, heart-pounding, wondering if their voice matters. Now, because of one challenge, one act of courage, and one refusal to stay invisible, the answer was clear, not shouted but whispered, like a note held just long enough to be felt. Yes, it does. And it always will. Years later, on a warm September evening, the crowd gathered under string lights in a park that had once been an empty lot. Folding chairs lined the grass, kids sat cross-legged near the front, and older folks leaned on canes, eyes bright with anticipation. It wasn't a festival or a big city concert, just a local summer series, the kind that happens in towns where people still know their neighbors' names. And tonight the headliner was her. She walked on stage in a simple shirt and jeans, trumpet case in hand, no entourage, no flashy intro. Just a wave, a small smile, and a nod to the sound engineer. The audience didn't roar. They didn't need to. Their silence was its own kind of applause, deep, expectant, full of trust. She played the first notes alone, a slow, familiar phrase that had started in a garage, traveled through farmers' markets and backstage rooms, and now floated over a sea of upturned faces. It was the melody her grandfather used to hum, the one that had no name but carried everything. Love, loss, memory, hope. And as she played, something remarkable happened, not on stage but in the crowd. A little girl tugged her mother's sleeve and whispered, "That's the song from the video." An old man closed his eyes and swayed slightly, as if dancing with someone only he could see. A teenager in the back, trumpet slung over his shoulder, mouthed the notes like a prayer. This was her sound now, not polished to perfection, not engineered for streams, but alive in the way real things are. Imperfect, breathing, shared. Halfway through the set, a familiar figure stepped onto the stage from the wings. The musician, older now, hair more silver than black, moving a little slower, carried his own horn like it was an old friend. The crowd murmured, then hushed. He didn't take the spotlight. He stood just behind her, to the side, like a shadow that had decided to speak. They played together, not as legend and protege, but as equals. Their phrases wove around each other, his bold and fiery, hers tender and grounded, creating something neither could make alone. At one point he launched into a fast, dazzling run, testing the air like he used to. She didn't try to match it. Instead, she held a single, soft note beneath it, steady as a heartbeat. And somehow that note held everything together. When the song ended, he stepped forward, raised his trumpet in a silent salute, not to the crowd but to her, and walked off stage. No words. None were needed. After the show, people lingered, not for autographs but for conversation. A high school band director asked for advice on reaching quiet kids. A parent thanked her for inspiring their daughter to pick up the trumpet. A young woman, barely out of college, handed her a CD of her own recordings. "You made me believe I could do this," she said, voice trembling. She took the CD, looked the woman in the eyes, and said, "Now go make someone else believe it too." Back at her hotel that night, she didn't scroll through reviews or check streaming numbers. She sat by the window, trumpet resting on her lap, and thought about how far she'd come. Not in miles or fame, but in understanding. She'd once thought music was something you chased, something you earned through hours of lonely practice. Now she knew it was something you gave, something you passed on, like a secret or a recipe or a well-worn story told at bedtime. Her career hadn't followed the usual path. She'd turned down big label deals that wanted her to smooth out the edges or add more pop. She'd walked away from interviews that focused more on her looks than her sound. Instead, she built something quieter but sturdier, a life where music served people, not algorithms. She recorded albums in home studios, toured in vans with friends who played cello and upright bass, and always made time for free workshops in towns that rarely saw live jazz. And every year, without fail, she returned to her hometown for the garage sessions. The program had grown, now with guest teachers, donated instruments, even a small scholarship fund, but the spirit remained the same. No auditions, no pressure, just a space where kids could discover that their voice matters even if it shakes at first. The musician still showed up sometimes, though less often now. He'd sit in the back, arms crossed, watching her guide a nervous 12-year-old through their first scale. Afterward, they'd share coffee on the porch of her childhood home, talking about everything and nothing, old gigs, new students, the way music changes when you stop trying to control it. You ever think about how it all started? He asked her once, steam curling from his mug. Every day, she said. Funny thing, he mused. I thought I was doing you a favor that night. Turns out you saved me. She looked at him, surprised. I was getting tired, he admitted, going through the motions. Playing the hits, collecting the checks, but you reminded me that music isn't about being the best. It's about being real. And that's worth more than any spotlight. She didn't say anything, just reached over and squeezed his hand. Two musicians, decades apart, bound not by fame but by a single moment of honesty in a backstage hallway. Now, as she packed her trumpet after the park concert, a message buzzed on her phone. It was from the old teacher, the one with the living room full of sheet music. He rarely texted. This one was short. Saw the live stream. You played like you finally made peace with your ghosts. Proud of you. She smiled, thumb hovering over the screen. Then she typed back, thanks for teaching me they weren't ghosts. Just echoes of people who loved me. She didn't post about the show online. Didn't upload clips or quote reviews. Some things weren't meant for screens. They were meant for sidewalks, for practice rooms, for the quiet space between two notes where real connection happens. The next morning, she took a train to a nearby city where a youth center had invited her to lead a workshop. The room was small, the instruments secondhand, but the kids' eyes were wide with curiosity. One boy, maybe 10, held a trumpet with dents just like her grandfather's. Is it hard? He asked. Yeah, she said honestly. But not because of the notes. Because you have to be brave enough to sound like yourself. She showed them how to breathe, how to form their lips, how to make that first squeaky sound without giving up. And when the boy finally got a clear note out, the whole room cheered. Not because it was perfect, but because it was his. Later, as she walked to the station, she passed a garage with the door open. Inside, a teenager was practicing, eyes closed, lost in the music. She paused, listened for a moment, then kept walking. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice. Just let the sound hang in the air like a promise, because that's how it spreads. Not through grand gestures, but through quiet moments of courage. Through one person showing up when no one expects them to. Through a challenge that wasn't really a challenge at all, but an invitation. The world still loves its stars. The loud ones, the flashy ones, the ones who fill stadiums and trend online. But real change? Real connection? That happens in the margins, in garages, in farmers markets. In the space between a mentor's nod and a student's first true note, she never set out to change the music world. She just wanted to play honestly. And in doing so, she gave others permission to do the same. Now, when she headlines her own shows, she always leaves the last song open. Not for a solo, but for a guest. Someone from the audience, someone unknown, someone who just wants to try. Sometimes they're shaky. Sometimes they're brilliant. But every time the crowd listens like it matters, because it does. And every time she steps back, gives them the mic, and lets them speak. That's the legacy. Not trophies on a shelf or millions of streams, but the quiet chain of moments where one person says, I see you, and another says, thank you, and the music keeps going. Long after the lights go down and the chairs are stacked away, the echo remains. In a child's first note, in a grandfather's hum, in the silence between two people who finally understand that greatness doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes, it just wears a hoodie, practices in a garage after dark, and dares to answer a call no one thought would be heard. And that, more than any duel, any stage, any spotlight, is what changes everything.